"You're coming with me," growled Samuel Granger through the Wyoming blizzard, his calloused hands cutting barbed wire from a woman's bleeding wrists. At her feet, 3 newborn girls lay dying in the snow, punishment for the sin of being born female. This is a story of survival, redemption, and the kind of love that burns brighter than any storm. It's 1877, and in the unforgiving wilderness, one man's decision will change everything. Stay with me until the end of this tale and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far our story travels across the world. The wind howled like a dying animal across the Wyoming territory, carrying with it the kind of cold that could freeze a man's soul solid. February 1877 had been merciless, dumping snow upon snow until the drifts reached the eaves of Samuel Granger's cabin. For 3 days he hadn't been able to check his cattle, hadn't been able to venture beyond the barn without risking his own neck to the storm's fury. But on this 4th night, as he sat by his fire nursing a cup of coffee black enough to wake the dead, he heard something that made his blood run colder than the wind outside. A woman's scream, Samuel's weathered hands stilled on his cup. The sound came again, weak, desperate, barely audible above the storm's roar. He'd lived alone on this godforsaken mountain for 8 years, and in all that time he'd heard plenty of things that could make a man's hair stand on end. The screech of a mountain lion, the death wail of an elk caught in a trap, the crack of trees splitting in the cold, but never the sound of a woman crying for help. He was on his feet before his mind caught up to his body, pulling on his heavy coat and wrapping a wool scarf around his neck. His rifle came down from above the mantel. A man didn't venture into a Wyoming blizzard unarmed, especially not when something felt this wrong. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside, the wind driving snow into his face with the force of thrown gravel. He squinted into the white darkness, following the sound of that voice, weaker now, fading like a candle in the wind. "Hello," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Where are you?" The only answer was the howl of the wind and the creak of pine boughs heavy with snow. Samuel pushed forward, his boots sinking deep with each step. The fence line was somewhere ahead. He could feel it more than see it, the way a man learns the boundaries of his own land through years of walking every inch. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags caught on his fence posts. But as he drew closer, the lantern light revealing details he'd rather not see, he realized what he was looking at made his stomach turn to lead. A woman, maybe 25 years old, tied to his fence with barbed wire. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where she'd struggled against her bonds. Her dress, once fine cloth, now torn and stained with blood, hung in tatters around her thin frame. Her dark hair was matted with ice, her lips blue with cold. But it was what lay at her feet that nearly brought Samuel to his knees. 3 infants, so small they could have fit in his hands, wrapped in nothing but scraps of torn petticoat. 2 were still breathing. He could see the faint puff of their breath in the frigid air. The 3rd lay motionless, already claimed by the cold. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel whispered, dropping to his knees beside the woman. Her eyes fluttered open, the palest blue he'd ever seen, like chips of winter sky. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that was lost in the wind. "Don't try to talk," Samuel said, his fingers already working at the barbed wire. The metal had bitten deep into her flesh, and every movement sent fresh blood flowing down her arms. "I'm going to get you free." The wire fought him, twisted tight and frozen in place. Samuel's hands were already numb, but he kept working, cursing under his breath as the barbs bit into his own fingers. Behind him he could hear one of the babies starting to cry, a thin, weak sound that cut through the wind like a knife. "Hold on," he muttered, whether to the woman or the children or himself, he couldn't say. "Just hold on." Finally, mercifully, the wire gave way. The woman collapsed forward into his arms, her body so light he could have been holding a child. But when she looked up at him, he saw a strength in those pale eyes that took his breath away. "My girls," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, My girls. Samuel looked down at the 3 infants. The one who'd been crying had gone quiet. Whether from exhaustion or something worse, he didn't want to know. But the other living child was still breathing, still fighting. "I've got them," he said, though he had no idea how he was going to carry a wounded woman and 3 babies through a blizzard. "I've got all of you." He gathered the infants first, tucking them inside his heavy coat, where his body heat might keep them alive a few minutes longer. The woman tried to stand, but her legs gave out immediately. Without hesitation, Samuel swept her up in his arms, feeling how the cold had already seeped deep into her bones. "What's your name?" he asked as he started the treacherous journey back to his cabin. "Clara," she whispered against his chest. "Clara Quinn?" The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd heard stories about Joseph Quinn, the cattle baron who owned half of Sweetwater County, the man who ruled his empire with an iron fist and a quick temper. If this was his wife. "Who did this to you?" Samuel asked, though he was already afraid he knew the answer. Clara's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "My husband, because I gave him daughters instead of sons." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Samuel felt something dark and dangerous unfurl in his chest, an anger so hot it could have melted the snow around them. He'd seen plenty of evil in his 35 years on this earth. He'd fought in the war, watched good men die for bad reasons, seen what greed and hatred could do to a person's soul. But this leaving a woman and her newborn children to die in a blizzard because they weren't born male, this was a kind of evil that made his hands shake with rage. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, as his cabin finally came into view. "You're coming with me now, and anyone who wants to take you away from here is going to have to go through me first." The warmth of the cabin hit them like a blessing as Samuel kicked the door shut behind them. He laid Clara on his bed, then carefully extracted the babies from his coat. 2 were still breathing, their tiny chests rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The 3rd, Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, offering up a prayer for the little soul that hadn't made it. Then he focused on the living. "We need to get them warm," Clara whispered from the bed, "and they need to eat." Samuel had delivered calves in his time, helped with difficult births when the neighbors needed an extra hand. But human babies were different. Smaller, more fragile, needier than any creature he'd ever cared for. "What do they need?" he asked, already stoking the fire higher. "Milk. Goat's milk if you have it, and something warm to wear." Clara tried to sit up, but Samuel gently pressed her back down. "I'll handle it. You just rest." He had one old nanny goat in the barn kept for her milk, and stubborn refusal to die despite her advanced age. Samuel bundled himself back up and ventured into the storm, returning 20 minutes later with a pail of warm milk and an armload of clean rags. By the time he'd fashioned makeshift clothes for the babies and managed to get a few drops of milk into their mouths, the sun was beginning to rise behind the storm clouds. The wind had died down to a whisper, and for the first time in hours, Samuel allowed himself to believe they might all survive the night. Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her breathing deep and regular. The 2 surviving babies, both girls he could see now, were tucked into a drawer he'd lined with soft blankets, sleeping the deep sleep of the very young. The 3rd baby he'd wrapped carefully and placed in his woodshed. When the storm cleared, he'd dig a proper grave. Samuel settled into his chair by the fire, his rifle across his knees. Because if Joseph Quinn was capable of what he'd seen tonight, the man might very well come looking to finish the job. As the morning light filtered through his windows, Samuel studied the woman sleeping in his bed. Even battered and exhausted, she was beautiful, the kind of beauty that spoke of strength rather than softness. Her hair, now dry and clean of ice, fell in dark waves across his pillow. Her hands, despite the wounds on her wrists, were graceful and long-fingered, but it was her face that held him. Even in sleep, there was a determined set to her jaw, a stubbornness in the line of her mouth that told him this woman was a fighter Whatever Joseph Quinn had done to break her, he hadn't succeeded. One of the babies started to fuss, and Clara's eyes opened immediately. She sat up carefully, wincing at the pain in her torn wrists, and reached for the crying child. "Hey there, little one," she murmured, gathering the baby against her chest. I know, this wasn't how it was supposed to be." Samuel watched as she began to nurse the child, her movements gentle despite her obvious pain. The sight stirred something in his chest he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct that went deeper than mere kindness. "What are their names?" he asked quietly. Clara looked up at him, and for a moment he saw her as she must have been before, young, hopeful, probably in love with the idea of the man she'd married. "This is Eloise," she said, stroking the baby's downy head. "The other one is Ruth, and the one who—" Her voice broke slightly. "June. Her name was June." "Pretty names," Samuel said. "All of them. My husband said they were too fancy for girls who'd probably end up as servants anyway." Clara's voice was bitter. "He said I could call them whatever I wanted since they'd be dead soon enough." The anger that had been simmering in Samuel's chest flared again, hot and dangerous. What kind of man says that about his own children? The kind who only wanted sons to carry on his name. Clara shifted Eloise to her other arm as Ruth began to wake. "I gave him 3 daughters in one birth, and he called it a curse on his house. Said I was a failure as a wife and a woman." Samuel stood up abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "He tied you to that fence," Samuel said, his voice carefully controlled. "Left you and your babies to die in a blizzard." Yes, the simple word hung in the air like a death sentence. Samuel turned back to face her, and Clara was surprised by the intensity in his dark eyes. "Then he's no husband," Samuel said, "and he sure as hell is no man." For the first time since he'd found her, Clara smiled. It was small and sad, but it was real. "I keep telling myself I should have known," she said. "Should have seen what kind of person he was before I married him, but I was 17 and stupid, and my father needed the money." "You were a child," Samuel said firmly. "What happened to you isn't your fault." Clara looked down at her daughters, both now sleeping peacefully against her chest. "Joseph won't just let this go. When the storm clears, he'll come looking." "Let him come," Samuel said, his voice like granite. "This is my land, and you're under my protection now." "You don't understand," Clara said urgently. "He has money influence, men who'll do whatever he asks. You can't stand against all that." Samuel moved closer to the bed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ma'am, I've stood against worse things than Joseph Quinn. I fought at Antietam and Gettysburg. I've faced down rustlers and claim jumpers and men who'd kill you for the boots on your feet. I'm still here, and they're not." He knelt beside the bed, his voice gentling. "You don't know me and I don't know you, but I found you dying in the snow with your babies, and that makes you my responsibility now. I don't take that lightly." Clara stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. All she saw was quiet determination and something else, something that made her chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for strangers?" Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "I had a family once," he said, "a wife and a son. Cholera took them both while I was away fighting. By the time I got home, they'd been in the ground for 3 months. Clara's breath caught. "I'm sorry. I swore that day that if I ever got the chance to save someone's family, I'd take it." Samuel's eyes met hers. "Today I got that chance." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile stirring of trust. "I don't even know your last name," she said softly. "Granger, Samuel Granger." "Well, Mr. Granger," Clara said, managing a stronger smile this time. "I think my daughters and I are very lucky you found us." No luck about it, Samuel said, standing and moving back to his chair. Sometimes God puts people exactly where they need to be. Over the next several days, as the storm finally cleared and the world turned white and still, they began to find a rhythm. Samuel proved surprisingly adept at caring for the babies, his large hands gentle as he changed their makeshift diapers and helped with their feeding. Clara grew stronger each day, though the wounds on her wrists would leave scars she'd carry forever. They talked in the quiet hours, sharing pieces of their lives, like traders exchanging precious goods. Samuel told her about his farm back in Ohio, how he'd left everything behind after his family died and wandered west looking for a place where the memories couldn't follow. Clara spoke of her childhood in a house where daughters were barely tolerated, how she'd dreamed of finding a man who would value her for more than her ability to bear sons. "What will you do?" Samuel asked on their fourth morning together. They were sitting by the fire, Ruth sleeping in his arms, while Clara nursed Eloise. "When you're well enough to travel, I mean." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no money, no family who'd take me in. Joseph made sure I was completely dependent on him." "You could stay here," Samuel said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. "I can't ask you to," Clara began. "You're not asking. I'm offering." Samuel looked down at Ruth, who had wrapped one tiny fist around his finger. "This place. It's been empty too long, full of ghosts and regrets. Maybe it's time for some life to come back to it." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. "Joseph will never stop looking." "Then we'll be ready for him," Samuel said simply. Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound that would change everything, hoofbeats in the distance growing closer. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, passing Ruth to Clara and reaching for his rifle. "Get the babies and get behind the bed," he ordered, his voice sharp with command. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Clara's face went white. "It's him," she whispered. "It has to be him." "Maybe," Samuel said, checking his ammunition, "but maybe it's just someone lost in the storm. Either way, you stay hidden until I say otherwise." The hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin. Samuel moved to the window, peering carefully through the frosted glass. 3 men sat on horseback, their faces hard as winter stone. He recognized the type hired muscle, the kind of men who sold their guns and their consciences to whoever paid best. The man in the center dismounted his expensive coat and fine boots, marking him as different from the others. Older, softer around the middle, but with eyes like chips of ice. Joseph Quinn. Samuel had never seen the man before, but he knew him instantly. The arrogance in his posture, the casual cruelty in the way he looked at Samuel's modest cabin, this was a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. And he wanted his wife back. The knock on the door came sharp and imperious, the kind of summons that expected immediate obedience. "Open up!" Quinn's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "I know she's in there." Samuel took a deep breath, settled his rifle in his hands, and opened the door. The 2 men faced each other across the threshold, one soft and pampered by wealth, the other hardened by years of frontier life. The contrast couldn't have been starker. "Mr. Quinn, I presume," Samuel said mildly. "Where is she?" Quinn demanded, his pale eyes scanning the cabin's interior. "Where's my wife?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Quinn's laugh was ugly. "Don't play games with me, cowboy. I know Clara's here. Her tracks in the snow led straight to your door." Samuel stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. The movement put him closer to Quinn, close enough to see the veins standing out in the other man's neck. "Even if that were true," Samuel said quietly, "why would you want her back? From what I hear, you already threw her away." Quinn's face flushed red with anger. "What I do with my property is none of your concern." "Property?" Samuel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Is that what you call a woman and her babies? She's my wife, and those brats are mine too. The law says so. The law, Samuel repeated. The same law that says a man can't leave his family to die in a blizzard. Quinn's hired men shifted in their saddles' hands, moving closer to their weapons. But Samuel didn't take his eyes off their employer. I don't know what lies she's told you, Quinn said, but Clara's sick. Delusions, hysteria, it runs in her family. She wandered off in the storm, probably trying to hurt herself and the babies. I'm here to take her home where she can get proper care. It was smoothly done. Samuel had to give him credit for that. A perfectly reasonable explanation that would satisfy any court in the territory. The word of a respected businessman against that of a frontier drifter and a hysterical woman. That's quite a story, Samuel said. Except for one thing. What's that? I found barbed wire wrapped around her wrists, cut deep enough to leave scars for life. Samuel's voice never changed tone, but something in his eyes made Quinn take a step back. Now, I'm not a learned man, but I can't figure how a woman having delusions would tie herself up with barbed wire. Quinn's composure slipped for just a moment, long enough for Samuel to see the truth beneath the lies. Then the mask was back in place, smooth as silk. Like I said, she's sick. Probably cut herself on a fence trying to get away from whoever was helping her. The mind can play terrible tricks. Mr. Quinn, Samuel said, his patience finally reaching its end. I'm going to give you one chance to ride off my land and never come back. Quinn laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. Or what? You'll fight all three of us. You might get one, maybe two, but the third will put you down. Samuel smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Maybe, but I guarantee you'll be the first to die. The words hung in the cold air like a promise of violence. Quinn's hired men were professionals. They recognized the look of a man who'd killed before and would do it again without losing sleep. This isn't over, Quinn said, backing toward his horse. I'll be back with the sheriff and a court order. You do that, Samuel replied. But remember, this is Wyoming territory. Out here, a man's home is his castle, and a woman asking for sanctuary gets it. Quinn mounted his horse, his face twisted with rage and frustration. She's my wife, my property. Not anymore, Samuel said quietly. She was never yours, and she sure as hell ain't yours now. As the three riders disappeared into the distance, Samuel remained on his porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he go back inside, where he found Clara standing by the window with both babies in her arms. You heard all that? Samuel asked. Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. He'll be back, with more men next time. Let him come, Samuel said, hanging his rifle back above the mantel. This mountain has swallowed bigger problems than Joseph Quinn. Clara moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used to wash her hair. Why are you doing this, really? Samuel looked down at her, at this woman who'd been broken and left to die, but still stood tall, still fought for her children's lives. In her pale blue eyes, he saw something he'd thought lost forever: hope. Because some things are worth fighting for, he said simply, and you and your girls are three of them. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the pines like a warning. But inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, something new was being born. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The fragile beginning of a family, forged not by blood or law, but by choice and courage, and the kind of devotion that could weather any storm. Samuel Granger had found his purpose at last, and Joseph Quinn was about to learn that some men couldn't be bought, threatened, or broken. The war for Clara's freedom was just beginning. The days that followed Quinn's visit moved like honey, poured in winter, slow, deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that each peaceful moment was borrowed time. Samuel found himself listening for hoofbeats in every gust of wind, watching the tree line for movement that didn't belong. But life in the cabin had taken on a rhythm all its own, one that surprised him with its rightness. Clara proved to be more resilient than her fragile appearance suggested. Within a week, she was helping with the cooking, mending his worn shirts with neat, careful stitches, and managing the care of Eloise and Ruth with the quiet competence of a woman who'd been born to motherhood. The babies grew stronger each day, their cries lusty and demanding, their tiny fists reaching for everything within grasp. "They're going to be handful," Samuel observed one morning watching Ruth grab a fistful of Clara's hair during feeding time. "All the best women are," Clara replied gently, extracting her hair from the baby's grip. "My mother used to say that quiet girls grow up to be quiet women, and quiet women get walked on." Samuel looked up from where he was whittling a toy horse by the fire. "Is that what happened to you?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing Ruth's cheek. "I thought being quiet would keep me safe. I thought if I just agreed with everything Joseph wanted, never argued, never complained, he'd eventually see my worth. And instead he saw weakness, and weak things get discarded when they're no longer useful." Clara shifted Ruth to her shoulder, patting the baby's back with practiced ease. "I won't make that mistake again." There was steel in her voice now, a hardness that hadn't been there when Samuel first found her in the snow. Whatever innocence Joseph Quinn had failed to destroy through cruelty, his abandonment had finished. The woman sitting in Samuel's cabin was no longer the frightened girl who'd been sold into marriage at 17. "Good," Samuel said simply. "The world's got enough quiet women in it." As February gave way to March, Samuel began preparing for spring. The snow was starting to melt in earnest, creating rushing streams where none had existed before. Soon the mountain passes would be clear, and with them would come the possibility of visitors, some welcome, others decidedly not. "I need to ride into town," Samuel announced one morning as he pulled on his heavy coat. "We're running low on supplies, and I want to hear what people are saying." Clara's face tightened with worry. "What if Joseph—" "He won't try anything in broad daylight with witnesses around," Samuel assured her. "But I need to know what story he's been telling, what kind of legal pressure he might bring to bear." Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Eloise. "How long will you be gone? 2 days, maybe 3, long enough to get what we need and gauge the lay of the land." Samuel moved to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. "Will you be all right?" The question carried more weight than simple concern for her physical well-being. In the weeks since he'd found her, Clara had rarely been alone, rarely forced to confront the full weight of her situation, without his steady presence to anchor her. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice wasn't entirely convincing. "We'll be fine." Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a small revolver, its metal worn smooth by years of use. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Clara stared at the weapon as if it were a snake. "Joseph never allowed me to touch guns. He said they were too dangerous for women." "Joseph Quinn's an idiot," Samuel said bluntly. "A gun's just a tool, like a hammer or a plow. It's the person holding it that makes it dangerous." He placed the revolver on the table beside her chair. "It's loaded, and there's extra ammunition in the drawer. If anyone comes to this door that you don't know, you point this at them and pull the trigger. Don't hesitate. Don't warn them. Just shoot." Clara picked up the gun with obvious reluctance, surprised by its weight. "I don't know if I could actually shoot someone. If it comes down to protecting your daughters, you'll find out what you're capable of," Samuel said grimly. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that." He left at first light, his horse's hooves crunching through the remaining snow as he made his way down the mountain. Clara watched from the window until he disappeared around a bend in the trail, then turned back to face the suddenly too quiet cabin. Without Samuel's presence to fill the space, the cabin felt larger and emptier. Every creak of the settling wood, every whistle of wind through the eaves made her jump. The revolver sat on the mantel where she'd placed it, its dark metal seeming to absorb the firelight. But as the day wore on, Clara found herself settling into a different kind of peace. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly alone, not hiding from a husband's temper, not walking on eggshells to avoid triggering his rage, not constantly calculating how to make herself smaller and quieter and more invisible. She was alone, and she was safe. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She sank into Samuel's chair by the fire, Eloise sleeping in her arms, and let herself really feel it. The absence of fear was so profound, it was almost dizzying. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered to the sleeping baby. "Think we might actually make it through this?" Eloise stirred but didn't wake, her tiny features peaceful in the firelight. Looking at her daughter, Clara felt something fierce and protective unfurl in her chest. Whatever happened next, whatever Joseph might try to do, these girls would never know the kind of fear she'd lived with. They would grow up strong and proud and unafraid. She was still sitting by the fire when she heard the sound that made her blood turn to ice. Horses approaching at a gallop. Clara was on her feet in an instant, grabbing the revolver from the mantel. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. Through the glass, she could see two riders approaching through the twilight. Not Joseph's hired men, but strangers. One was an older man with a silver star pinned to his coat, the sheriff. The other was younger, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as a lawyer or businessman. Clara's worst fears crystallized into certainty. Joseph had made good on his threat to bring legal pressure to bear. The knock on the door came firm and official. "Mrs. Quinn, this is Sheriff Morrison. I need to speak with you." Clara's hands shook as she checked the revolver's chamber. Samuel had been right, it was loaded and ready. But could she really shoot a lawman, even one doing Joseph's bidding? "Mrs. Quinn, I know you're in there. I just want to talk." Clara took a deep breath and moved to the door, though she didn't open it. "What do you want?" "Your husband's filed a complaint, ma'am. Says you kidnapped his children and ran off with a man. He's asking for the law's help in bringing you home." The words hit Clara like physical blows. Kidnapped, ran off. The way Morrison said it made her sound like some kind of criminal, a woman who'd abandoned her family for illicit passion. "That's not what happened," Clara called through the door. "Then why don't you tell me your side of it?" Morrison's voice was patient, reasonable. "Open the door, Mrs. Quinn. Let's talk this through like civilized people." Clara pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. If she let them in, they'd see the healing wounds on her wrists, the evidence of what Joseph had done. But they'd also see two healthy babies and no sign of the violence Joseph claimed she'd committed. More importantly, they'd see that she wasn't the broken, hysterical woman Joseph had described. Clara opened the door. Sheriff Morrison was a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. The younger man beside him had the soft look of someone who'd never worked with his hands, his pale skin unmarked by sun or weather. "Mrs. Quinn," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat, "thank you for opening the door. This here's Mr. Carlyle from the Territorial Attorney's Office." Carlyle stepped forward with the confidence of a man used to having his word taken as law. "Mrs. Quinn, your husband is very worried about you. He says you've been suffering from difficulties since the birth of your children. He just wants to bring you home where you can get proper medical care." Clara felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through hours tied to a fence post in a blizzard. But this time she didn't swallow it down. This time she let it show. "Medical care," she repeated, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Is that what you call it?" She rolled up her sleeves, exposing the healing wounds on her wrists. Both men's eyes widened at the sight of the deep, angry marks left by barbed wire. "Your husband did this to you?" Morrison asked, his voice suddenly tight. "My husband tied me to a fence post with barbed wire and left me to die in a blizzard," Clara said steadily, "along with our 3 newborn daughters. One of them didn't survive the cold." Carlyle shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Quinn, your husband mentioned that you might make wild accusations." "Wild accusations?" Clara's voice rose and both babies stirred at the sound. "Would you like to see the grave? It's in the woodshed waiting for the ground to thaw so we can bury her properly." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's face had gone pale, while Carlyle looked like a man who'd just realized he'd walked into a trap. "Ma'am," Morrison said slowly, "are you saying your husband attempted to murder you?" "I'm saying my husband decided that a wife who couldn't give him sons was worse than useless. He told me exactly what he thought of me and my daughters before he tied that wire around my wrists." Clara moved to the mantel where a small wooden box sat beside Samuel's tobacco pouch. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a lock of dark hair, all she had left of little June. "This is my daughter," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "She lived for maybe an hour before the cold took her. Her name was June, and she died because her father thought her life was worth less than his pride." Morrison stared at the lock of hair, his expression growing harder by the moment. When he looked up, there was something dangerous in his eyes. "Where's Mr. Granger?" he asked. "Gone to town for supplies. He should be back tomorrow. And he's the one who found you. He saved my life," Clara said simply. "Saved both my daughters' lives. If he hadn't heard me crying in the storm—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The image was clear enough: 3 more graves in the woodshed, waiting for spring. Carlyle cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Quinn, even if what you're saying is true, the law still recognizes your husband's rights. You are his wife, and those children are his property under territorial statute." "Property!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "My children are property. That's not how I meant." "That's exactly how you meant it," Clara said, her pale eyes blazing. "Just like Joseph meant it when he said the same thing." "Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Carlyle. I am not property. My daughters are not property. And any law that says otherwise isn't worth the paper it's written on." Morrison held up a hand before Carlyle could respond. "Mrs. Quinn, I need you to understand something. What you're describing, if it's true, is attempted murder. That's a hanging offense in Wyoming territory. If it's true—" Clara laughed bitterly. "You think I gave myself these scars? You think I killed my own child for sport? No, ma'am, I don't." Morrison's voice was firm, "But proving it in court is another matter entirely. Your husband has money influence connections. He can afford lawyers who'll paint you as an unstable woman given to fantasy and delusion." Clara felt her heart sink. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it during the long hours of Samuel's absence. But hearing it laid out so starkly still hit her like a physical blow. "So he wins," she said quietly. "He tries to murder me and my children, and he wins because he has more money." "Not necessarily," Morrison said. "There are other options, such as, come back to town with me, bring the babies, bring evidence of what he did. Let me arrest Joseph Quinn and put this before a judge." Clara stared at him. "You'd do that, even knowing what kind of power he has?" Morrison's smile was grim. "Mrs. Quinn, I've been wearing this badge for 15 years. In that time, I've seen rich men get away with plenty of things they shouldn't have. But attempted murder of a woman and children—" He shook his head. "That's a line even money can't cross, not in my county." Hope flared in Clara's chest, fragile as a candle flame. "What about my daughters? If Joseph is arrested, what happens to them?" "That would be up to the court," Carlyle said reluctantly. "But given the circumstances, I imagine temporary custody could be arranged pending the outcome of the trial." "Temporary custody with whom?" Morrison and Carlyle exchanged glances. "Well," Morrison said slowly, "I suppose that would depend on who was willing to take responsibility for their care." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "Someone like Samuel Granger, if he was willing and if the court found him suitable." Morrison nodded. "It's possible." For the first time since opening the door, Clara felt like she could breathe properly. Not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. A path forward that didn't end with her and her daughters back under Joseph's control. "There's something else you should know," Carlyle said quietly. "Your husband, he's not just angry about losing face. He's talking about remarriage. Apparently he's already begun negotiations with another family for a new bride." The words hit Clara like a slap. Already, a 16-year-old girl from a ranch east of here, families having financial difficulties, and Quinns offered to pay their debts in exchange for their daughter's hand. Clara closed her eyes, seeing herself at 17, young, hopeful, trusting. Another girl about to walk into the same trap that had nearly killed her. Her name's Sarah Mitchell, Morrison added. Sweet girl from what I hear, deserves better than what's waiting for her. They all do, Clara said softly, then louder, what do you need from me? Come back to town, Morrison said. Bring the babies, bring anything that might serve as evidence. Let me do my job. Clara looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the fire that had warmed her through the darkest nights of her life, at the chair, where Samuel sat each evening whittling toys for her daughters. Leaving felt like tearing away pieces of her soul, but staying meant condemning another girl to the hell she'd barely escaped. All right, she said, but I wait for Samuel to return. I won't leave without telling him what I'm doing. Morrison nodded. Fair enough. But Mrs. Quinn, once we start this, there's no going back. You'll have to see it through to the end, whatever that might be. Clara thought of June's lock of hair, of the scars on her wrists of a 16-year-old girl who had no idea what was coming for her. Sheriff, she said quietly, I've already been to hell and back. A courtroom doesn't scare me. After the lawmen left, Clara sat by the fire with her daughters in her arms and tried to process everything that had just happened. In the space of an hour, her entire world had shifted again. The quiet refuge she'd built with Samuel was about to be shattered, replaced by the harsh glare of public scrutiny and legal proceedings. But perhaps that was as it should be. Hiding in the mountains might keep her safe, but it wouldn't keep other women safe. It wouldn't stop Joseph from destroying the next girl who couldn't give him what he wanted. When Samuel returned the next evening, tired and dust-covered from his journey, Clara was waiting for him on the porch. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. They came, he said. It wasn't a question. Sheriff Morrison and a territorial attorney. Joseph's filed charges claiming I kidnapped the girls and ran off with you. Samuel's jaw tightened. And I told them the truth. All of it. Clara stood moving to stand beside him. Morrison wants to arrest Joseph, but I have to come back to town to testify. It's a risk, Samuel said after a long moment. A big one. I know, but there's something else. Clara told him about Sarah Mitchell, about the 16-year-old girl walking unknowingly toward the same fate Clara had barely escaped. Samuel listened in silence, his face growing darker with each word. When Clara finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains that had sheltered them both. You have to go, he said finally. I know. I'm coming with you. Clara felt her heart skip. You don't have to. Clara. Samuel turned to face her, his dark eyes steady and sure. I told you that first night that anyone who wanted to take you away from here would have to go through me. That hasn't changed. This is different. This is legal proceedings, not a gunfight. Sometimes they're the same thing, Samuel said grimly. Either way, you're not facing it alone. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, tears of gratitude, of fear, of something deeper and more complicated. What about the ranch, your life here? Samuel looked around at the land he'd called home for 8 years, at the mountains that had been his refuge and his prison, this place. It's been good to me, but it was never really living, just surviving. You and the girls, you've brought life back to it. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Wherever you go, that's where I want to be. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Clara searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or reservation. All she saw was quiet certainty and something that made her breath catch in her throat. Samuel, she whispered. I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know you've got no reason to trust any man after what you've been through, But Clara, I love you. I love your girls. I love the family we've built here, and I'll fight anyone who tries to tear it apart. Clara stared at him, this man who'd found her dying in the snow and given her back her life, who'd carved toys for her daughters and taught her to shoot and never once made her feel like anything less than precious. "It is too soon," she said softly. Samuel's face fell slightly, but he nodded. "I understand, but I love you too." Clara continued, watching his expression transform. "I love your kindness and your strength and the way you look at my daughters like they're the most important things in the world." Samuel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together." "Together," Clara agreed. They stood there on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, two people who'd found each other in the depths of winter and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of everything they'd built together. But tonight they had this, the promise of love spoken freely, the warmth of a home they'd created together, and the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for. In the distance, a wolf howled, not a sound of menace, but of wildness, of freedom, of things that refused to be tamed or broken. Clara smiled and squeezed Samuel's hand tighter. They left the mountain on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air tasted of coming snow. Samuel drove the wagon while Clara sat beside him, both babies bundled against the cold in blankets she'd sewn from his spare shirts. The small wooden box containing June's lock of hair rested in Clara's lap, a tangible reminder of what they were fighting for. The journey to town took most of the day, the wagon wheels cutting deep ruts in the muddy road. They passed other travelers, ranchers heading to market, a family of settlers moving west, a circuit preacher on his weekly rounds. Most nodded politely, but Clara caught the curious glances, the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. Word had already begun to spread. "You sure about this?" Samuel asked as the first buildings of Sweetwater came into view. Clara looked down at Eloise, sleeping peacefully despite the wagon's jolting. "As sure as I can be about anything anymore." The town was larger than Clara remembered from her brief visit as Joseph's new bride 3 years ago. New buildings had sprouted along Main Street, a hotel, a second saloon, a millinery shop with lace curtains in the windows. Progress was coming to Wyoming territory, bringing with it the kind of civilization that would either protect women like Clara or crush them under the weight of respectability. Sheriff Morrison met them at his office, his weathered face grave as he helped Clara down from the wagon. "Mrs. Quinn, Mr. Granger, I'm glad you came." "Any word on Joseph?" Samuel asked, securing the horses. Morrison's expression darkened. "That's what we need to talk about. He's not making this easy." Inside the sheriff's office, the story unfolded like a map of treacherous territory. Joseph had been busy since Morrison's visit to the cabin, using his wealth and connections to paint himself as the wronged husband, Clara as the unstable wife, and Samuel as the opportunistic drifter who'd taken advantage of a woman's delusions. "He's hired the best lawyer in the territory," Morrison explained, pouring coffee that was strong enough to strip paint. "Fellow named Harrison Walsh comes up from Cheyenne. Man's never lost a case involving domestic disputes." Clara felt her stomach clench. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need to be smarter than we are rich," Morrison said grimly. "And we need evidence that can't be explained away by fancy words and legal maneuvering." He led them to a back room where Carlyle was waiting with another man, older, with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. Morrison made the introductions. Judge William Hendricks, territorial magistrate, the man who would ultimately decide Clara's fate. "Mrs. Quinn," Judge Hendricks said, rising from his chair, "I've heard troubling allegations about your treatment at your husband's hands." Clara straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "They're not allegations, Your Honor. They're facts." "I'd like to hear those facts from you directly, if you're willing." For the next 2 hours, Clara laid out her story in careful, precise detail. She spoke of her arranged marriage, of Joseph's growing anger as her pregnancies failed to produce sons, of the night he'd decided that daughters were worse than no children at all. She showed them her scars, let them examine the barbed wire marks that would never fully fade. Judge Hendricks listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When Clara finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. "These are serious charges," the judge said finally. "If proven, they could result in your husband facing the gallows." Clara's voice sharpened. "Your Honor, with respect, what more proof do you need?" "Physical evidence for one thing," Hendricks replied. "The wire used to bind you witnesses to your condition when you were found, medical testimony about your injuries." "I can provide all of that," Samuel interjected. "I still have the wire I cut from her wrists. Dr. Patterson can testify to the condition I brought her to his office in—" "Samuel," Morrison interrupted quietly, "there's something else you need to know. Dr. Patterson, he's not going to testify." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Samuel's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "What do you mean he won't testify?" "I mean Joseph Quinn made it clear that any medical man who testifies against him will find his practice suddenly very difficult to maintain in this territory." Clara felt the walls closing in around her. "He's bought them off." "Threatened them off, more likely," Morrison corrected. "It's one thing to stand up to a bully when you're the only one at risk. It's another when your family's livelihood depends on keeping your mouth shut." Judge Hendricks leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "This presents a significant problem. Without medical testimony to corroborate the extent of Mrs. Quinn's injuries at the time of her rescue, we're left with her word against her husband's, and Mr. Quinn has several witnesses prepared to testify to his wife's instability." "What witnesses?" Clara demanded. Carlyle consulted his notes. "Your former housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton. She's prepared to testify that you showed signs of increasing irrationality following the birth of your children. Apparently you were heard talking to yourself, crying at odd hours, displaying what she calls unnatural attachment to the infants." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was exhausted and grieving. I'd just given birth to triplets, lost one of them, and my husband was treating me like a broodmare that had failed at her one job." "I understand that," Carlyle said gently, "but from the outside looking in—" "From the outside, it looks like a woman losing her mind," Clara finished bitterly. "There's more," Morrison said reluctantly. "Joseph's also claiming that you and Mr. Granger were involved before the birth, that the children might not even be his." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd never even met Samuel until the night he found her dying in the snow, but she could see how easily the story could be twisted. A lonely rancher, a neglected wife, a convenient excuse for a husband to rid himself of an inconvenient family. "That's a lie," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. "We know that," Morrison assured him, "but proving it is another matter entirely." Judge Hendricks stood, his expression grave. "Mrs. Quinn, I want you to understand the situation you're facing. Your husband has resources, connections, and a legal team that specializes in making problems disappear. You have the truth, which is powerful, but truth alone doesn't always carry the day in a courtroom." "Then what do you suggest?" Clara asked. "Fight smart," Hendricks said. "Find evidence that can't be disputed or explained away. Find witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated, and pray that justice is stronger than money." That night they took rooms at the hotel's separate rooms, despite their relationship, because appearances mattered in a town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire. Clara lay in the narrow bed with her daughters, sleeping beside her, staring at the ceiling and trying to quiet the fear that gnawed at her insides. A soft knock at her door made her heart jump. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened it to find Samuel standing in the hallway, his face troubled. "Can't sleep either?" he asked quietly. Clara shook her head, stepping aside to let him enter. He moved to the window, staring out at the darkened street below. "We could leave," he said suddenly. "Take the girls and disappear. Head west to California or north to Montana. Start over somewhere Joseph's name doesn't carry weight." "Run away, you mean?" "Survive," Samuel corrected. "Sometimes that's the most important thing." Clara joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And leave Sarah Mitchell to face what I faced." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Sarah Mitchell isn't your responsibility." "Isn't she?" Clara turned to face him. "I'm probably the only person alive who knows exactly what Joseph is capable of. If I run away, if I let him paint me as a crazy woman who abandoned her family, what happens to the next girl he decides to marry?" "Clara, she'll die," Clara said flatly. "Maybe not the first time she disappoints him, maybe not the second. But eventually, when she fails to give him what he wants or becomes more trouble than she's worth, she'll die. And it'll be my fault for not stopping him when I had the chance." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, seeing the steel that had been forged in the crucible of her suffering. This was no longer the broken woman he'd found in the snow, but someone harder, stronger, tempered by pain into something unbreakable. "All right," he said finally. "Then we fight. But we fight smart." "What do you mean?" Samuel's smile was sharp as a blade. "I mean, we stop playing by their rules and start playing by ours." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Morrison burst into the hotel dining room where Clara and Samuel were sharing breakfast, his face flushed with excitement and anger in equal measure. "There's been a development," he announced, pulling up a chair. "Joseph tried to force the marriage contract with Sarah Mitchell last night." Clara's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "Tried?" The girl refused, locked herself in her room, and threatened to throw herself out the window if anyone tried to make her go through with it. Morrison's grin was fierce. Seems she'd heard some interesting rumors about what happened to Joseph's first wife. "Where is she now?" Samuel asked. "Safe for the moment. Her father's not happy about losing Quinn's money, but he's not willing to force her into marriage at knife point." Morrison leaned forward. "Here's the interesting part. She wants to testify." Clara felt her heart skip. "About what?" "About the conversation she overheard between Joseph and her father. Apparently Quinn was quite specific about what he expected from a wife and what happened to wives who disappointed him." Hope flared in Clara's chest, bright and dangerous. "He threatened her." "Better than that," Morrison said, his eyes gleaming. "He bragged. Told her father exactly what he'd done to you and why. Said it was necessary to show the new wife what happened to women who didn't know their place." The words hit Clara like a thunderbolt. After all Joseph's careful manipulation, all his lawyer's smooth explanations about her mental instability and delusions, he'd undone himself with his own arrogance. "Will she testify in court?" Samuel asked. "She's willing, but there's a problem." Morrison's expression darkened. "Joseph knows she heard him. He's claiming she's lying to get out of the marriage contract, and he's putting pressure on her family to keep her quiet." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that involves their ranch going into foreclosure next month if they can't pay their debts." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders. Every time they found a potential ally, Joseph's money and influence found a way to silence them. "There might be another way," Samuel said thoughtfully. Both Morrison and Clara looked at him expectantly. "What if we don't wait for the formal trial?" Samuel continued. "What if we force Joseph to show his true colors in public where his lawyers can't protect him?" "How?" Clara asked. Samuel's smile was cold as winter wind. "By making him angry enough to forget he's supposed to be playing the role of the grieving husband." The plan they hatched was dangerous, dependent on precise timing and Joseph's own arrogance. It required Clara to do something that terrified her more than facing down armed men. She had to walk into the lion's den and trust that Samuel would be there to pull her out. That evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, Clara walked alone down Main Street to toward the cattleman's hotel where Joseph had taken up residence. She wore her best dress, the one she'd been married in, now altered to fit her post-pregnancy figure, and carried Eloise in her arms. Ruth was safe with Samuel at the sheriff's office, but Clara needed one of her daughters with her for what came next. The hotel lobby was crowded with ranchers and businessmen, the kind of men who shaped the territory's future over whiskey and cigars. Conversations died as Clara entered, all eyes turning to the woman who'd become the talk of the town. Joseph was holding court near the fireplace, regaling his audience with what was undoubtedly his version of recent events. He looked up as Clara approached his face, cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation in the space of a heartbeat. "Clara," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Hello, Joseph," Clara replied, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I thought it was time we talked." Joseph's companion shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension crackling between husband and wife. Joseph himself maintained his composure, but Clara could see the rage building behind his pale eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Perhaps we could speak privately." "No," Clara interrupted. "I think our business should be conducted in public, don't you? After all, you've made our private affairs quite the topic of conversation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Joseph's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Clara, you're clearly not well. Why don't you let me take you home where you can get the help you need?" "Help?" Clara's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Like the help you gave me the night our daughter died." The crowd stirred, sensing drama. Joseph's face flushed, but he kept his voice level. "Our daughter died because you wandered off in a blizzard, putting yourself and the children at risk. You were having delusions, Clara. The doctor said nothing." Clara cut him off. "Because you made sure he wouldn't examine me properly. Just like you made sure no one would ask too many questions about the barbed wire cuts on my wrists." Joseph's composure cracked slightly. "You did that to yourself. You were out of your mind with grief. I was tied to a fence post and left to die." Clara's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the lobby. "You tied me up with barbed wire because I gave you daughters instead of sons. That's enough." Joseph snapped, his mask of concerned husband finally slipping. "You're making a scene." "I'm telling the truth," Clara shot back. "The same truth you bragged about to Thomas Mitchell when you were trying to buy his daughter." Joseph went very still. Around them, the crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread. Clara could see Samuel positioned near the door, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "I don't know what lies you think you've heard," Joseph began. "Sarah Mitchell heard every word," Clara said clearly. "She heard you describe exactly how you punished wives who disappointed you. She heard you threaten to do the same to her if she didn't produce sons." Joseph's face was turning, red veins standing out on his forehead. "That little bitch is lying to get out of her obligations." "So now you're calling a 16-year-old girl a liar," Clara pressed. "Just like you called me crazy. You are crazy." Joseph exploded, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "You're a worthless woman who couldn't give me sons. I should have gotten rid of you years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that lobby had heard Joseph Quinn, pillar of the community and respected businessman, admit to wanting to get rid of his wife for the crime of bearing daughters. Joseph seemed to realize what he'd just said. He looked around at the shocked faces surrounding him, at the women who'd drawn back in horror, at the men who were reassessing everything they thought they knew about him. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "I was speaking in anger." "No," Clara said quietly. "You were speaking the truth. Finally." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute stillness. "This man tied me to a fence with barbed wire and left me and my newborn daughters to die in a blizzard," she said. "One of my babies froze to death because of his cruelty. I survived only because Samuel Granger heard my cries and risked his life to save us." She paused, looking directly at Joseph. And now he wants to do the same thing to Sarah Mitchell, because in his mind we're not people. We're just breeding stock to be discarded when we fail to meet his expectations. The crowd began to murmur, voices rising in shock and outrage. Joseph realized he was losing control of the narrative, his face contorting with rage. "You lying whore!" he snarled, lunging toward Clara. "I'll teach you to spread lies about me." But Samuel was already moving, intercepting Joseph before he could reach Clara. The two men collided with bone-jarring force, crashing into a nearby table and sending glasses flying. Joseph was soft from years of easy living, but he was desperate and furious. He swung wildly at Samuel, catching him across the jaw with a lucky punch. Samuel staggered back, blood flowing from his split lip. "You want her so bad?" Joseph panted, circling like a rabid dog. "You can have what's left when I'm done with her." He pulled a knife from his boot, a long, wicked blade that gleamed in the lamplight. The crowd scattered, women screaming as Joseph advanced on Clara with murder in his eyes. "This is what happens to wives who don't know their place," he screamed, raising the blade. Samuel tackled him from behind, sending both men sprawling across the floor. They rolled and fought Joseph, slashing wildly with the knife, while Samuel tried to control the blade. Clara pressed back against the wall, Eloise crying in her arms, watching her past and future battle for dominance. The knife caught Samuel across the ribs, opening a line of red through his shirt. He grunted but didn't let go, using his superior strength and experience to force Joseph's wrist back. "Give up," Samuel growled. "It's over." "It's never over," Joseph spat. "She's mine. She'll always be mine." The knife turned in his grip, the blade now pointing toward his own chest as Samuel forced it back. Joseph's eyes widened in sudden understanding. No, the blade slid home with a wet sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Joseph's body went rigid, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak. Then he went limp. Samuel rolled away, breathing hard, his hand pressed to the cut on his ribs. Around them, the hotel lobby was in chaos, women fainting, men shouting, someone calling for the doctor. But Clara only had eyes for the man who'd just saved her life. She sank to her knees beside Samuel, Eloise, still in her arms, and reached out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. Samuel caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "I'm fine, are you?" Clara looked down at Joseph's body, at the man who'd terrorized her for 3 years, who'd left her to die, who'd murdered her daughter through his cruelty. She felt no satisfaction in his death, no sense of victory or revenge. All she felt was free. "Yes," she said, her voice steady for the first time in years. "I'm fine." Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen too much violence. Behind him came Judge Hendricks, his face grave as he surveyed the carnage. "What happened here?" Morrison demanded. A dozen voices began talking at once, each witness eager to share what they'd seen. But the story that emerged was clear and consistent. Joseph Quinn had attacked his wife with a knife, and Samuel Granger had defended her. The knife had turned during the struggle, killing Quinn accidentally. Judge Hendricks listened to the testimonies, his expression thoughtful. When the last witness had spoken, he turned to Clara. "Mrs. Quinn, or should I say Mrs. Granger?" Clara blinked in surprise. "I'm not married to Samuel. We're not that, we haven't—" "Perhaps not legally," Hendricks said with the ghost of a smile. "But in the eyes of everyone who saw what just happened, you're his woman, and he's your man. That's a kind of marriage that runs deeper than law." He gestured to Joseph's body. "This man is dead by his own hand, killed by his own violence turned back on him. As far as I'm concerned, justice has been served." Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, tears of relief, of grief for the years she'd lost, of hope for the future she might finally have. Samuel struggled to his feet, ignoring the blood seeping through his shirt. He moved to stand beside Clara, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield against the world. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Judge Hendricks looked around the lobby at the faces of the people who'd witnessed Joseph Quinn's final fatal outburst of violence. "Now," he said, "now you go home, both of you, and you build the life you should have had all along." The journey back to the mountain felt different this time, lighter somehow, as if the very air had changed, now that Joseph Quinn's shadow no longer fell across their path. Samuel drove the wagon with one arm, his other pressed against the bandaged wound on his ribs, while Clara sat beside him with both girls sleeping in her lap. The wooden box that had held June's lock of hair now contained something else, the deed to Joseph's ranch, signed over to Clara by a territorial judge who believed that widows deserved more than empty condolences. "I still can't believe it's over," Clara said as they crested the final hill before home came into view. Samuel glanced at her, noting the way she'd called his cabin home without seeming to realize it. "Are you having second thoughts about the ranch, I mean? You could make a good life there with all that land and the cattle." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the familiar outline of Samuel's cabin emerge from the trees. It looked small compared to the grand house she'd inherited, humble in its simplicity. But as they drew closer, she saw something the mansion had never possessed: windows that glowed with warmth instead of judgment, a porch that invited rather than intimidated, walls that promised safety instead of imprisonment. "I spent 3 years in that house," she said finally. "It was never home. This place, from the first night you brought me here, this felt like home." Samuel's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Then home it is." They spent the first week settling back into the rhythm of mountain life, but everything was different now. Samuel moved his things to the barn, insisting that Clara and the babies should have the cabin's single bedroom. He built a larger crib to accommodate both girls as they grew, whittling intricate designs into the headboard, flowers for Eloise, stars for Ruth, and a small angel for June, whose memory would always be part of their family. Clara found herself watching Samuel with new eyes, seeing past the protective barriers she'd built around her heart during her marriage. She noticed how gently he handled the babies, how he sang to them, in a voice rough with disuse but warm with affection. She saw how he anticipated her needs before she voiced them, bringing her coffee at exactly the right moment, stoking the fire when she shivered, standing guard over her sleep like a faithful sentinel. Most of all, she noticed how he never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He'd declared his love that night on the porch, but he didn't use it as a weapon or a burden. Instead, he simply lived it day by day in 1,000 small acts of devotion that asked nothing in return. It was Clara who finally broke the careful distance they'd maintained. She found him in the barn one evening, mending harness by lamplight. The wound on his ribs was healing well, though he still favored his left side when he thought no one was looking. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work, gathering her courage for what she was about to do. "Samuel," she said softly. He looked up, and something in her expression made him set down his work entirely. "The girls are sleeping," Clara continued, stepping into the barn, "and I've been thinking about you sleeping in the barn when there's a perfectly good cabin with a fireplace and a real bed." Clara took a breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "About how you've been taking care of us for months without asking for anything in return. Clara, about how I love you." She said the words rushing out before she could lose her nerve. "Not just because you saved my life, though you did. Not just because you're good to my daughters, though you are. I love you because when I look at you, I see the man I want to spend the rest of my life with." Samuel stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you sure after everything you've been through?" "I'm sure," Clara said firmly. "I know the difference between a man who takes and a man who gives, between someone who sees me as property and someone who sees me as precious." Samuel crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "I love you, Clara Granger." "Granger," Clara smiled through sudden tears. "Is that a proposal?" "It's a promise," Samuel said, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. "If you'll have me." "Yes," Clara whispered, and then louder with joy bubbling up from depths she'd forgotten she possessed. "Yes, yes, yes." When Samuel kissed her, it was nothing like the perfunctory pecks Joseph had bestowed when he wanted something. This was gentle and fierce and full of promise, a kiss that spoke of devotion freely given and gratefully received. Clara felt something in her chest unfurl, like a flower turning toward the sun, not just love, but trust, but the belief that happiness was possible after all. They were married 3 weeks later by the circuit preacher with Sheriff Morrison and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric they'd bought in town, simple blue wool that brought out her eyes and flattered her figure. Samuel had traded his work clothes for a proper suit, though he looked uncomfortable in the stiff collar and polished shoes. The babies slept through the ceremony in Moses baskets decorated with wildflowers. When the preacher asked if there were any objections to the union, Clara found herself holding her breath, half expecting Joseph's ghost to rise and claim her. But there was only silence, broken by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant cry of a hawk. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said, and Samuel did thoroughly and joyfully while Morrison whooped and his wife dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Afterward, they had a simple dinner at the cabin, venison stew and fresh bread with wild berry tart for dessert. Morrison regaled them with stories of his own courtship, how he'd wooed his Martha with terrible poetry and a voice that could make angels weep. Mrs. Morrison shared gossip from town, including the news that Sarah Mitchell had accepted a proposal from the banker's son, a young man who reportedly thought daughters were just as precious as sons. As evening settled over the mountains, their guests departed, with promises to visit again soon. Samuel and Clara stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the trail, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into the peaceful silence of the wilderness. "So," Samuel said, slipping his arm around Clara's waist, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Granger?" Clara leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt, to be held without fear, to be touched with love instead of possession. "It feels like coming home," she said simply. That night they lay together in the big bed Samuel had built with his own hands, Clara's head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Through the window they could see stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Do you think June can see us?" Clara asked softly. Samuel's arm tightened around her. "I think she knows her mama is safe and happy. I think that's all any child wants for their parents." Clara closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had brought Samuel into her life. She'd lost so much: her innocence, her first child, years of her life, to a man who'd seen her as nothing more than a broodmare, but she'd gained something infinitely more precious, a love built on respect and choice, a family forged in fire and tempered by adversity. Spring melted into summer, and with it came changes that transformed their simple mountain retreat into something more. Word had spread about Clara's story, about the woman who'd survived her husband's attempt to murder her and the man who'd defended her honor. Travelers began stopping at their cabin, drawn by curiosity at first, but staying for Clara's cooking and Samuel's quiet wisdom. Most were just passing through, prospectors heading to the gold fields, settlers seeking new lands, cowboys driving cattle to market, but some lingered, drawn by the peace they found at the Granger homestead. A young widow named Mary Hutchinson stayed for 2 weeks after her wagon broke down, helping Clara with the babies and marveling at a household where women were valued for more than their ability to birth sons. "How do you do it?" Mary asked one afternoon as they hung laundry on the line Samuel had strung between 2 pines. "How do you trust him so completely?" Clara paused in her work, considering the question. In the months since their marriage, she'd watched Samuel prove his character in countless small ways. He'd never raised his voice to her, never lifted his hand except in gentleness, never made her feel small or stupid or worthless. When she disagreed with him, and she did frequently, he listened to her arguments and respected her opinions. "He's never given me a reason not to trust him," Clara said finally, "and I've learned that trust isn't something you give all at once. It's built one day at a time, one choice at a time." Mary nodded thoughtfully. She was barely 20, with the kind of ethereal beauty that attracted the wrong kind of attention from men who saw women as conquests rather than companions. Her husband had died of fever during their journey west, leaving her alone and vulnerable in a territory that didn't coddle widows. "I've had 3 proposals since Henry died," Mary confided, "all from men who want to take care of me." She said the words with obvious distaste. "But none of them look at me the way Samuel looks at you." Clara glanced toward the corral where Samuel was breaking a young Mustang with patience and skill. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, not the practiced charm of a man trying to win something, but the simple joy of a husband catching sight of his beloved wife. "How does he look at me?" Clara asked. "Like you're the most beautiful thing he's ever seen," Mary said softly, "like he can't quite believe his luck in finding you." That evening, as they sat by the fire after Mary had retired to the small guest room Samuel had built onto the cabin, Clara shared the conversation with her husband. "She's not wrong," Samuel said, whittling a new toy for the girls, a wooden horse with flowing mane and detailed saddle. "I do feel lucky every single day." "Even when I burn the biscuits," Clara teased. "Especially then," Samuel said solemnly. "Reminds me you're human instead of some angel I dreamed up." Clara laughed, the sound rich and warm in the firelit cabin. "I'm definitely human, complete with morning breath and milk stains on my dress." Samuel set down his carving and moved to kneel beside her chair. "Clara Granger," he said seriously, "you are the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Not because you're perfect, though you're perfect for me, but because you're real. Because you're strong enough to survive hell and kind enough to help other people find their way out of it." As if to prove his point, Mary appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she whispered, "but I had a nightmare about Henry and I—" "Come here, sweetheart," Clara said, immediately rising to embrace the younger woman. "You don't have to apologize for grieving." They spent the next hour talking by the fire, Clara and Samuel sharing their own stories of loss and healing, while Mary gradually opened up about her fears for the future. By the time she returned to her room, she was calmer, comforted by the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her struggles. "You see," Samuel said as they prepared for bed, "that's what I mean about helping people. You have a gift for it." Clara considered this as she brushed her hair. It was true that their cabin had become an unofficial sanctuary for travelers in need not just of food and shelter, but of hope. Word was spreading along the mountain trails about the couple who'd found love after tragedy, who welcomed strangers and never turned away anyone genuinely in need. "Maybe that's why we went through everything we did," Clara said thoughtfully, "so we could help others who are going through the same things." Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, meeting her eyes in the small mirror above their washstand. "Maybe so, though I'd trade all the good we might do for the chance to have spared you that pain." Clara leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and utterly dependable. "I wouldn't," she said quietly. "If I hadn't gone through what I did, I never would have ended up here, with you, with this life we've built." "You don't mean that." "I do," Clara said firmly. "I'm not grateful for the abuse, Samuel. I'll carry those scars forever, but I'm grateful for where it led me. I'm grateful for the strength I found in surviving it. Most of all, I'm grateful for you." Summer deepened into autumn, bringing with it a steady stream of travelers seeking shelter and guidance. Samuel built additional rooms onto the cabin, creating space for guests while maintaining privacy for their growing family. Clara's cooking became legendary along the mountain trails, but it was more than to food that drew people to their door. It was the sense of safety they found there, the knowledge that they would be accepted without judgment and helped without expectation of payment. A grizzled old prospector named Jake Thompson became a regular visitor, stopping by whenever his wanderings brought him through their territory. He regaled them with tales of strike-it-rich dreams and mining camp disasters, but Clara noticed that his visits always coincided with times when he seemed particularly lonely or discouraged. "You two saved my life," he told them one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Not from dying, though that stew of yours probably did that too, Clara, but from giving up hope entirely." "How do you mean?" Samuel asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the wilderness that had been his home for more than 20 years. "I've seen what gold fever does to men," he said finally. "Seen it turn decent folks into thieves and killers. Seen families torn apart by greed and ambition." He gestured toward the cabin behind them, where the babies could be heard cooing and babbling as they played with their toys. "But watching you two, seeing how you've built something good and clean and honest, it reminds me that there are still things in this world worth more than gold." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Jake, that's one of the sweetest things anyone's ever said to us." "It's the truth," the old man said gruffly, "and truth's about the only currency I got left that's worth anything." As autumn gave way to winter, their first as a married couple, Clara found herself marveling at the difference between this season and the last. A year ago, she'd been trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing her spirit, pregnant with children her husband saw as burdens. Now she was surrounded by love, Samuel's unwavering devotion, her daughter's innocent joy, and the affection of friends who'd chosen to consider their cabin a haven. The babies were growing with startling rapidity. Eloise had begun pulling herself up on furniture, her chubby fingers exploring everything within reach. Ruth was more cautious but equally determined, preferring to observe before attempting new adventures. Both girls had inherited their mother's pale blue eyes and their father's, Samuel's, steady temperament. "Do you think they'll remember him?" Clara asked one evening as they watched the girls play on a blanket by the fire. "Their biological father, I mean." Samuel considered the question carefully. He'd become their father in every way that mattered, but he knew the girls' parentage was something they'd need to understand as they grew older. "They'll know the truth," he said finally, "when they're old enough to understand it properly. But Joseph Quinn was their biological father, not their papa. There's a difference." "What kind of difference?" "A father contributes seed," Samuel said quietly. "A papa teaches you to fish and helps you with nightmares and shows you how to treat people with kindness." He looked down at Eloise, who was attempting to chew on his boot. "Any fool can father a child. It takes a real man to be a papa." Clara felt her heart swell with love for this man, who'd claimed her daughters as his own, without hesitation or reservation. "They're lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Samuel replied, lifting Ruth when she began to fuss. "I get to watch them grow up. I get to be the man who teaches them their worth, who shows them how they deserve to be treated by any man who wants to court them someday." The thought of her daughters as grown women, making their own choices about love and marriage, filled Clara with both hope and determination. They would never face the limited options she'd had, would never be sold into marriage to pay their family's debts. They would know their value, would understand that they deserved to be cherished rather than merely tolerated. "Promise me something," Clara said suddenly. "Anything. Promise me that if anything happens to me, you'll make sure they know their mother loved them, that I fought for them, that I chose this life, this family, because I wanted them to see what real love looks like." Samuel's expression grew fierce. "Nothing's going to happen to you. Not while I'm breathing. Promise me anyway." Samuel studied her face, seeing the shadows that would always linger there, reminders of a time when love had been weaponized against her, when the man who should have protected her had become her greatest threat. "I promise," he said solemnly, "but I'm planning on growing old with you, Clara Granger, planning on watching our girls get married and bounce our grandbabies on their knees, planning on sitting on that porch when we're both gray and wrinkled, arguing about whose turn it is to milk the cow. Clara smiled through sudden tears. That sounds perfect. When winter settled over the mountains like a familiar blanket, but this year it brought comfort rather than fear. The cabin was well stocked with supplies, the animals were healthy and sheltered, and the small family had everything they needed to weather whatever storms might come. On Christmas Eve, they held their first celebration as husband and wife. Clara had spent weeks preparing baking pies and cookies, sewing new dresses for the girls, knitting Samuel a warm sweater to replace his worn one. Samuel had carved an entire menagerie of wooden animals for Eloise and Ruth, each one detailed with painstaking care. But the greatest gift was intangible, the peace of being surrounded by love, freely given and gratefully received. As they sat by the fire after the babies had been put to bed, Clara found herself thinking about the previous Christmas. She'd been hugely pregnant then, sick and exhausted, listening to Joseph complain about the expense of feeding extra mouths. The contrast was so stark it felt like remembering someone else's life. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, noticing her distant expression. "Last Christmas," Clara admitted, "but how different everything is now." Samuel took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint scars on her wrist, reminders of her past that had faded but never fully disappeared. "Do you ever regret it? The path that led you here?" Clara considered the question seriously. The pain she'd endured, the fear she'd lived with the child she'd lost, all of it had carved deep grooves in her soul that would never fully heal. But from those wounds had grown something beautiful, the capacity to recognize real love when she found it, the strength to fight for what mattered, the wisdom to value the simple blessings of safety and peace. "No," she said finally. "I regret Joseph's cruelty, regret that June didn't live to see this happiness. But I don't regret the path that led me to you." Samuel raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I love you, Clara Granger." "I love you too," Clara replied, "more than I ever thought possible." Outside, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, blanketing the mountains in pristine white. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled merrily while husband and wife held each other close, surrounded by the quiet breathing of sleeping children and the perfect contentment of love freely chosen and faithfully kept. The harsh winter of their first meeting had given way to the warmth of spring, the growth of summer and the harvest of autumn. Now, as they faced their second winter together, they did so not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners united by choice, commitment, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than steel. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the moon, but the sound no longer spoke of danger or loneliness. Instead, it sang of wildness tamed by love of freedom found in choosing to belong to someone who saw you as precious beyond measure. Clara smiled and settled deeper into Samuel's embrace, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the soft sighs of her daughters in their sleep. This was what happiness felt like, not the desperate joy of moments stolen between sorrows, but the deep, abiding contentment of a life built on solid foundations of love, trust, and mutual respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new visitors seeking shelter and guidance, new opportunities to extend the circle of their family's warmth. But tonight, there was just this, the perfect peace of being exactly where they belonged, with exactly the people they were meant to love. The hearth at Granger Ridge burned bright and steady, a beacon of hope in the wilderness, promising sanctuary to all who needed it, and reminding the world that sometimes the greatest victories were not won through violence, but through the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear. Years flowed like the mountain streams that carved their way through stone, steady, persistent, shaping the landscape of their lives into something beautiful and enduring. The cabin that had once sheltered 3 desperate souls had grown into a sprawling homestead, its welcoming lights visible from miles away. What the locals had begun calling the hearth at Granger Ridge had become more than a home. It was a sanctuary that drew the lost, the broken, and the hopeful from across the territory. Clara stood on the expanded porch watching her daughters chase fireflies in the meadow as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eloise, now 7, was all legs and determination, her dark hair flying behind her as she ran. Ruth, quieter but equally fierce, moved with calculated precision, her pale eyes tracking the dancing lights with scientific interest. Both girls wore practical clothes. Clara had sewn herself sturdy cotton dresses that could withstand climbing trees and chasing chickens, because the Granger girls were raised to believe the world belonged to them as much as to any boy. "Mama, I caught 3, Eloise called out, holding up a mason jar with holes punched in the lid. Ruth only caught 1, but hers is bigger. "Size isn't everything," Ruth replied with the dignity of someone twice her age. "Mine glows brighter." Clara smiled at the exchange. Her daughters had grown into their own people, each reflecting different aspects of the crucible that had forged their family. Eloise had inherited Samuel's courage and Clara's stubborn refusal to back down from a challenge. Ruth possessed her mother's analytical mind and her adoptive father's quiet wisdom. Both carried themselves with a confidence Clara had never known. At their age, the confidence of children who had never doubted their worth or their place in the world. 10 more minutes, Clara called out. "Then it's time for baths and stories." The girls groaned in unison but didn't argue. They'd learned that Clara's word was law, delivered with love, but enforced with consistency. Unlike Clara's own childhood, where rules had been arbitrary weapons, wielded by adults who saw children as burdens, the Granger household operated on principles of fairness and respect that applied to everyone regardless of age. Samuel emerged from the barn wiping his hands on a rag. At 43, he'd grown into his role as patriarch of their extended family with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and lines of laughter bracketed his eyes, evidence of years spent surrounded by joy instead of solitude. The wound Joseph Quinn had given him had healed into a thin scar across his ribs, barely visible now, but a permanent reminder of the night their old life had died and their new one had been born. "How many tonight?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Clara's. 4, Clara replied, consulting the small notebook where she kept track of their guests. The Mitchell family, they're moving west after losing their farm, a young preacher heading to establish a church in Colorado, and Mrs. Patterson with her granddaughter. Samuel nodded. He'd built their home to accommodate the steady stream of travelers who found their way to the ridge, but more importantly, he'd created a space where people felt safe enough to lower their guards and share their burdens. The dining room table that had once seated just their small family now stretched to accommodate 12, and they'd never had a meal where it wasn't full. "Mrs. Patterson's the widow from back east?" Samuel asked. "Her son died in a mining accident," Clara confirmed. "She's bringing her granddaughter to live with relatives in Oregon, but the child hasn't spoken since her father's funeral. She's about Ruth's age." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. He'd seen enough grief-stricken children over the years to recognize the signs of a soul struggling to heal. "What's the girl's name?" "Annie. Mrs. Patterson says she used to be a chatterbox, always singing and laughing. Now she just stares out windows and won't eat unless someone forces her." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter's joy-filled pursuit of summer's ephemeral magic. Both understood without speaking that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to extend the healing they'd found to someone who desperately needed it. It was work they'd never planned to do, but it had become as natural as breathing. The sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of their evening guests. The Mitchell family approached in a wagon loaded with all their worldly possessions, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion of people who'd lost everything and were starting over in middle age. Behind them rode a young man on horseback, the preacher from his plain black coat and serious demeanor. Bringing up the rear was an elegant carriage that seemed out of place in the wilderness, carrying the widow and her silent granddaughter. "Girls," Clara called out, "come help me welcome our guests." Eloise and Ruth abandoned their firefly hunt without complaint, running to the porch with cheeks flushed and eyes bright. They'd been helping to welcome strangers since they could walk, understanding instinctively that hospitality was not a chore but a privilege. Samuel approached the Mitchell wagon as the family climbed down, parents somewhere in their 40s. 3 children ranging from toddler to teenager, all wearing the threadbare dignity of people who'd once known better times. "Welcome to Granger Ridge," Samuel said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I'm Samuel Granger, and this is my wife Clara." "Tom Mitchell," the man replied, his handshake firm despite his obvious exhaustion. "This is my wife Helen, and these are our children, James, Mary, and little Susan." Helen Mitchell's smile was strained but grateful. "We can't thank you enough for taking us in. We've been traveling for weeks, and the children are probably tired and hungry," Clara finished kindly. "Why don't we get everyone settled and fed, and then we can talk?" The routine of welcoming guests had been refined over years of practice. Samuel and the older children took charge of the animals and luggage, while Clara led the women and younger ones into the house. The preacher, who introduced himself as Reverend Joshua Matthews, seemed amazed by the smooth efficiency of the operation. "How often do you do this?" he asked, watching Samuel organize sleeping arrangements for 3 families plus himself. "Often enough," Samuel replied with a smile, "though each group brings its own blessings and challenges." Mrs. Patterson emerged from the carriage with the assistance of a cane, her silver hair perfectly arranged, despite the long journey. Beside her stood a thin girl with enormous dark eyes and the kind of stillness that spoke of deep wounds. Annie Patterson looked like a child-sized ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. Clara's heart immediately went out to the girl. She'd seen that particular emptiness before in her own reflection during the worst days of her marriage, in the faces of other women who'd learned that the world could be cruel beyond imagination. But she'd also learned that such wounds could heal, given enough time, patience, and love. "You must be Annie," Clara said, kneeling to bring herself to the girl's eye level. "I'm Mrs. Granger, but you can call me Clara. These are my daughters Eloise and Ruth." Annie stared at Clara without speaking, her small hand gripping her grandmother's black dress. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "She hasn't said a word in 3 months. The older woman whispered. "The doctors back home said it's shock from losing her father so suddenly. They said she might never speak again." "Doctors don't know everything," Clara said firmly, her eyes still on Annie. "Sometimes the heart just needs time to find its voice again." Ruth stepped forward with the careful deliberation she brought to everything. In her hands was the glowing firefly she'd caught earlier, its light pulsing gently in the gathering darkness. "Would you like to hold her?" Ruth asked Annie quietly. "She's very gentle and she's not afraid of anything." For the first time since their arrival, something flickered in Annie's eyes, not quite interest but not complete absence either. She looked at the firefly, then at Ruth's serious face, then back at the tiny creature whose light seemed to dance just for her. Slowly, carefully, Annie extended her hand. Ruth placed the jar in her palm, and for a moment, the 2 girls stood connected by the simple miracle of shared wonder. "She likes you," Ruth said matter-of-factly. "Fireflies can tell when someone has a good heart." Annie's lips parted as if she might speak, but no sound came. Still, her grip on the jar was gentle but secure, and she lifted it to watch the fireflies dance more closely. "That's progress," Clara murmured to Mrs. Patterson, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I pray you're right," the older woman replied. "She was such a happy child before everything changed." Dinner that evening was a study in the complex choreography of communal healing. The long table accommodated all their guests, with room for the inevitable second helpings that Clara's cooking demanded. The Mitchell children, initially shy and uncertain, gradually relaxed under the influence of good food and Eloise's irrepressible charm. Reverend Matthews proved to have a dry sense of humor that paired well with Samuel's storytelling. Mrs. Patterson shared tales of her late husband's adventures as a ship captain, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of happier times. And throughout it all, Annie sat beside Ruth, still silent but present in a way she hadn't been upon arrival. She ate without prompting, listened to the conversation swirling around her, and occasionally glanced at the firefly jar beside her plate, as if drawing strength from its gentle glow. After the younger children had been put to bed, and the adults had gathered on the porch for coffee and quiet conversation, Clara found herself alone with Mrs. Patterson while the others discussed the territory's political future. "How long has it been since her mother died?" Clara asked gently. Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled slightly. 5 years. Consumption took her when Annie was only 3. Edward, my son, tried his best to be both parents to her, but mining work is dangerous and demanding. He was killed in a cave-in just before Christmas. Clara's heart ached for the child, who'd lost so much in her short life. "What about other family besides yourself?" "My daughter-in-law's sister lives in Oregon. She's agreed to take Annie in, but—" Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "Margaret means well, but she's never had children of her own. She sees Annie as a duty rather than a blessing. I'm afraid the child will never recover in such an environment." "Then why take her there?" "Because I'm 72 years old with a weak heart," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "I can't raise a young child at my age, much as I love her. Margaret is family, and family takes care of family, even when they're not particularly suited for it." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching through the window as Ruth showed Annie how to read by lamplight. The 2 girls were bent over a picture book, Ruth's finger tracing words while Annie followed along with rapt attention. "What if there was another option?" Clara asked carefully. Mrs. Patterson looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Annie could stay somewhere she'd be loved rather than tolerated, somewhere she could heal at her own pace without being seen as a burden?" Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. "You're talking about here, about your family." "I'm talking about what's best for Annie," Clara said firmly. "Ruth has already claimed her as a sister. Can you see how they are together? And Eloise would defend that child against an army if necessary." "But you don't even know us," Mrs. Patterson protested. "Why would you take on such a responsibility?" Clara's smile was soft with memory. "Because someone once did the same for me. Samuel found me with 2 babies in a blizzard near death and with nowhere to go. He took us in without knowing anything about us except that we needed help." She gestured toward the warm light spilling from their windows, the sound of her husband's laughter mixing with their guests' voices. "This life we have, this joy, this peace, this family, it all started because one man chose kindness over caution. If we can offer Annie even a fraction of what Samuel gave us—" Mrs. Patterson was crying openly now, tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Are you certain a child like Annie, who's been through such trauma, she might never fully recover? She might never speak again?" "Then we'll love her just as she is," Clara said simply. "Words aren't the only way to communicate love." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Mrs. Patterson wanted to do right by her granddaughter, but she also needed to be practical about her own limitations. Samuel, when Clara broached the subject with him later that evening, didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said immediately, "the girl belongs with Ruth. Can't you see it? They're like 2 halves of the same soul." "It won't be easy," Clara warned. "She might never fully heal from what she's lost." Samuel's smile was gentle. "Did you think you'd never fully heal when I found you in that blizzard?" Clara considered this, thinking of the woman she'd been, then broken, desperate, convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. Then she looked around their bedroom at the wedding photograph on the dresser, at the cradle Samuel had carved for each of their daughters, at the life they'd built from the ashes of their individual tragedies. "No," she admitted, I thought I was too damaged to ever be whole again." "And yet here you are," Samuel said, pulling her into his arms, "whole and beautiful and strong enough to heal other broken hearts." The paperwork was surprisingly simple. Mrs. Patterson had come prepared for the possibility that her original plan might not work out, carrying all the necessary documents to transfer guardianship if needed. Reverend Matthews, who'd been ordained in multiple territories, was qualified to witness the proceedings. By the end of their third day at the Ridge, Annie Patterson had legally become Annie Granger, though she still hadn't spoken a word. The moment that changed everything came a week later, after their other guests had continued on their journeys, and the family had settled back into their usual routine. Clara was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a sound that made her drop her wooden spoon. Laughter, high and bright and unmistakably joyful. She rushed to the window to see Annie and Ruth playing in the creek behind the house, their skirts hiked up as they waded through the shallow water chasing minnows. Eloise was orchestrating the game from the bank, calling out directions and encouragement, and Annie, silent still Annie, was laughing as if she'd never known sorrow. Samuel appeared at Clara's shoulder, drawn by the sound. Together they watched their 3 daughters, for that's what they were now, regardless of biology, splashing and shrieking with delight as they discovered the simple pleasure of being children together. "Listen," Samuel whispered. "Shimyum." Clara tilted her head, and there it was, faint but unmistakable. Annie's voice, rusty from disuse but real, calling out to Ruth, "Wait for me." Clara burst into tears, overwhelmed by the miracle of healing they'd just witnessed. Samuel held her close, his own eyes damp with emotion. "She's going to be all right," he murmured into her hair. "They all are," Clara replied, watching their daughters play with the unconscious grace of children who'd never doubted their place in the world. The years that followed were marked not by dramatic events, but by the accumulation of small joys that created a life of profound contentment. Annie blossomed under the Granger family's patient love, growing from a silent ghost into a vibrant young woman with a gift for music and an unshakable faith in the goodness of the world. Ruth became the family scholar, devouring every book that came within reach and corresponding with teachers as far away as Boston about her theories on everything from astronomy to agriculture. Eloise inherited her parents' gift for hospitality, turning their home into an even more welcoming haven for travelers and those in need. The Ridge itself became famous throughout the territory as a place where broken hearts could mend and lost souls could find direction. Politicians stopped by to gauge the mood of the common folk. Businessmen sought Samuel's advice on matters ranging from livestock to land management. Most importantly, women traveling alone or with children knew they could find sanctuary at the Granger homestead, no questions asked and no judgment rendered. Clara's story had become legend, though she discouraged the dramatic retellings that painted her as some kind of heroic figure. She preferred to focus on the present, on the family she'd helped create, the community they'd built, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their love had created ripples that extended far beyond their mountain home. One evening in late autumn, as the first snow of the season dusted the peaks around them, Clara found herself alone on the porch while Samuel tucked the girls into bed. At 15, 13, and 12, they were getting too old for bedtime stories, but none of them had outgrown their need for their father's quiet wisdom and gentle goodnight kisses. A movement in the forest caught her eye, a young woman emerging from the tree line, moving slowly, as if every step caused pain. Even in the dim light, Clara could see she was pregnant, her belly round with advanced pregnancy. Her clothes were torn, her hair disheveled, and she moved with the careful gait of someone who'd been hurt and was trying not to show it. Clara's heart clenched with recognition, not of the woman herself, but of what she represented: another soul, in desperate need of sanctuary, another chance for love to triumph over cruelty. "Samuel," she called softly through the open door. He appeared immediately, took one look at the approaching figure, and nodded grimly. They'd seen this before, would see it again. The territory was still a place where women had few rights and fewer protections, where desperate circumstances could drive people to acts of both cruelty and courage. Together they walked down from the porch to meet the stranger, their faces open and welcoming, despite the late hour and unusual circumstances. "Help me," the young woman whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." Clara reached for her without hesitation, offering the same support Samuel had given her all those years ago, in the snow. "You're safe now," she said firmly. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, you're safe now." As they helped the woman toward their house, Clara caught Samuel's eye and saw her own thoughts reflected there. Their life together had begun with a rescue in a blizzard, continued with the healing of broken hearts, and would apparently never stop providing opportunities to extend the grace they'd been given to others who needed it just as desperately. The fire that had been kindled in their hearts the night they first declared their love had indeed never died. Instead, it had grown and spread, warming not just their own family, but everyone who found their way to the hearth at Granger Ridge. And as Clara helped another lost soul towards safety, she understood that this endless cycle of love given and received was the true measure of a life well lived. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in pristine white, but inside the Granger home warmth and light prevailed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to heal and help and hope. Tonight there was simply this: a family united by choice rather than blood, a love that had conquered every obstacle placed in its path, and the quiet certainty that some fires burn so bright they can never be extinguished. In the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs to the moon, but their voices no longer spoke of loneliness or danger. Instead, they sang of wildness tamed by love, of strength tempered by gentleness, and of the enduring truth that home is not a place but a people, those who choose to see you as precious and treat you as such, no matter where you came from or what scars you bear. Clara smiled and tightened her arms around the stranger she was helping toward sanctuary, knowing that by morning this woman would no longer be a stranger but family. Because that's what love did, it expanded to include whoever needed it most, creating ever-widening circles of belonging that could encompass the whole world if given the chance. The hearth at Granger Ridge burned on a beacon of hope in the wilderness, proof that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through violence, but through the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear again and again, until love became not just a feeling, but a way of life that transformed everyone it touched. 25 years had passed since that first blizzard brought Clara Quinn to Samuel Granger's door, and the mountain that had once known only the silence of solitude now echoed with the laughter of 3 generations. What had begun as a desperate rescue had grown into something that transcended family. It had become a movement, a philosophy made manifest in wood and stone and the countless lives it had touched. Clara stood in the garden behind their expanded homestead, her hair now more silver than brown, watching her granddaughter Emma chase butterflies between the tomato plants. At 4 years old, Emma possessed the fearless curiosity that marked all the Granger children, along with the gentle confidence that came from never doubting her place in a world that loved her unconditionally. "Grandmama Clara," Emma called out, her voice bright with discovery. "Why do the butterflies keep flying away when I want to hold them?" Clara smiled, setting down her weeding basket to kneel beside the child. "Because butterflies know something we sometimes forget, sweetheart. Beautiful things don't need to be captured to be treasured. Sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones we appreciate from a distance." Emma considered this with the seriousness that 4-year-olds brought to profound questions. "But I want to love them, and you can," Clara assured her. "But loving something means wanting what's best for it, even if what's best isn't what we want for ourselves." It was a lesson Clara had learned in the crucible of her own suffering, refined through years of marriage to a man who'd understood it instinctively. Love wasn't possession, wasn't control, wasn't the right to reshape another person according to your own desires. Love was freedom given and received, trust offered without guarantee, and the daily choice to see the beloved as precious beyond measure. Clara, Samuel's voice carried from the workshop where he spent most of his mornings, now that his joints protested more vigorous work. At 67, he was still strong and vital, but time had gentled his movements and deepened the lines around his eyes. "We've got visitors coming up the trail." Clara shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching 3 riders approach at an easy pace. She recognized the lead figure immediately, Dr. Clara Quinn, who'd established the territory's first medical school and had become one of their most frequent correspondents. Behind her rode 2 younger women, one carrying a leather satchel that marked her as another physician. "Dr. Cameron," Clara called out, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried to greet their guests. "What a wonderful surprise." Clara Quinn dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades traveling frontier roads. In her 50s now, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who'd fought for every opportunity and refused to be diminished by those who believed medicine was a man's profession. "Clara, you look wonderful as always," Clara said, embracing her old friend warmly. "I hope you don't mind us arriving unannounced, but I have some people I wanted you and Samuel to meet." She gestured to her companions, both young women in their 20s dressed in practical traveling clothes but carrying themselves with the confident bearing of professionals. "This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who just completed her medical training in Philadelphia, and Miss Catherine Larson, who's finishing her studies to become a teacher." Clara studied the young women with interest, noting the way they looked at the Granger homestead with something approaching reverence. She'd seen that expression before on the faces of people who'd heard the stories and come seeking something they couldn't quite name. "Welcome to Granger Ridge," Clara said warmly. "You must be exhausted from the journey. Let's get you settled and fed, and then we can talk properly." As they moved toward the house, Samuel emerged from his workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands. Even after all these years, Clara felt her heart skip slightly at the sight of him, not with the desperate passion of new love, but with the deeper satisfaction of a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. "Ladies," Samuel said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him legendary among travelers throughout the territory, "welcome to our home." The afternoon unfolded with the familiar rhythm of hospitality that had become second nature to the Granger household. Ruth, now 30 and married to a lawyer in Denver, had come for her monthly visit with her own children, twin boys who worshipped their grandfather and considered the Ridge their true home despite living in the city. Eloise, 28 and recently engaged to a doctor who'd proven himself worthy by spending 3 months helping at the Ridge's informal medical clinic, bustled about ensuring their guests' comfort. Annie, 26, and the territory's most sought-after music teacher, entertained them with songs that had been passed down through the countless women who'd found refuge in their home. But it was during the quiet hours after dinner, when the children had been put to bed and the adults gathered around the fireplace, that the true purpose of Dr. Cameron's visit became clear. "I need to tell you something," Sarah began, her usually confident voice carrying an unusual note of emotion, "about what you've accomplished here and what it's meant to people far beyond this mountain." Clara and Samuel exchanged glances, both uncomfortable with praise. They'd never sought recognition for their hospitality, viewing it simply as the natural response to encountering need. "Dr. Cameron," Clara began. "Please let me finish," Sarah interrupted gently. "Dr. Martinez here graduated first in her medical class at the University of Pennsylvania. Do you know what her thesis was about?" Rebecca Martinez leaned forward, her dark eyes bright with passion. "It was about the psychological treatment of trauma in women and children based on case studies I'd collected from across the Western territories. And Mrs. Granger, your story Not just what happened to you, but how you recovered and went on to help others. It formed the foundation of my research." Clara stared at her in amazement. "I don't understand." Catherine Larson spoke up, her voice soft but determined. "Mrs. Granger, my mother was Sarah Mitchell, the girl who almost married Joseph Quinn. She used to tell me about the woman who saved her from that fate, who stood up in a hotel lobby and told the truth even when it put her own life at risk." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She remembered Sarah Mitchell, vividly young, frightened, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But she'd never known what happened to the girl after Quinn's death freed her from their engagement. "Your mother," Clara whispered, "married for love instead of duty thanks to your courage," Catherine continued. "She became a teacher herself, dedicated her life to educating young women about their rights and opportunities. When she learned I wanted to follow in her footsteps, she made me promise to find you someday and tell you how profoundly your actions had shaped not just her life, but the lives of all the girls she went on to teach." Samuel reached for Clara's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as they absorbed the magnitude of what they were hearing. The ripples of that long-ago confrontation in the hotel lobby had spread farther than they'd ever imagined, touching lives they'd never known existed. "There's more," Dr. Cameron said quietly. "Rebecca, tell them about the network." Dr. Martinez pulled out a thick folder from her satchel, spreading papers across the coffee table. "Over the past 5 years, I've been documenting something unprecedented in the medical literature, a network of women throughout the Western Territories who've established safe houses, medical clinics, and educational programs specifically for women and children escaping domestic violence." She pointed to various documents and photographs. "There's a shelter in Colorado run by a woman named Mary Hutchinson. She says she learned how to create sanctuary from a couple on a mountain ridge who took her in when her husband died. A school in Montana founded by 3 sisters who were inspired by the stories they'd heard about the Granger daughters. Medical clinics in California, Oregon, and New Mexico, all established by women who trace their inspiration back to this place." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she studied the evidence spread before her. Photographs of buildings, letters from grateful women, newspaper clippings about progressive policies, all connected by invisible threads to the simple decision she and Samuel had made to open their home to those who needed it. "You started something," Catherine said softly. "Not intentionally, maybe, but you showed people that love could be stronger than fear, that healing was possible, that one person's courage could change everything." Samuel cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "We never meant to start anything. We saw people who needed help, and we helped." "Exactly," Dr. Cameron said. "That's what made it so powerful. You didn't set out to change the world, you just chose to be kind over and over again until kindness became a revolution." The conversation continued long into the night. Stories shared and connections revealed that painted a picture of impact far beyond anything Clara and Samuel had imagined. They learned about legislation passed because of testimony from women who'd found their voices after healing at places inspired by the Ridge. They heard about medical advances driven by doctors who'd been influenced by the holistic approach to trauma treatment they'd witnessed or heard described. Most importantly, they discovered that their philosophy of love as a choice rather than a feeling had spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in communities across the growing nation. As the evening wound down and their guests retired to the rooms that had been prepared for them, Clara and Samuel sat alone by the dying fire, processing the revelations of the day. "Did you ever imagine?" Clara asked quietly. Samuel shook his head, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Never. I thought we were just helping individuals one at a time." "Maybe that's how all great changes happen," Clara mused. "One person, one act of kindness, one choice to do what's right instead of what's easy." She thought about the girl she'd been sold into marriage at 17 with no understanding of her own worth. She remembered the broken woman Samuel had found in the blizzard, convinced that she deserved the cruelty that had nearly killed her. The transformation from victim to survivor to healer had been gradual, almost imperceptible in its daily accumulations of small victories and recovered dignity. "I keep thinking about June," Clara said suddenly. Samuel's expression grew tender. Their firstborn daughter had been gone for 25 years, but she remained a presence in their lives, not as a source of sorrow, but as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "What about her? I used to think her death was the worst thing that ever happened to us," Clara said. "But what if it was also necessary? What if losing her gave us the pain we needed to understand other people's pain? What if her death made us into the people who could save all these other lives?" It was a thought both terrible and beautiful in its implications. The idea that even the greatest tragedies could be transformed into sources of healing for others. Samuel considered it carefully, his engineer's mind wrestling with the metaphysical complexities. "I don't know if I can go that far," he said finally. "But I do know that June's life, short as it was, had meaning. Every person we've helped, every child who's found safety here, every woman who's discovered her own strength, they're all part of her legacy too." Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Love wasn't a zero-sum game where helping one person meant neglecting another. Instead, it was an expanding force that grew stronger with each act of kindness, each choice to see the sacred in the ordinary, each decision to treat every human being as inherently valuable. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors, as word spread that Dr. Cameron was at the Ridge. Neighbors from miles around came to share their own stories of how the Granger family had touched their lives. Former guests returned with children and grandchildren in tow, wanting to show them the place where their family's fortunes had changed. Local officials sought counsel on policies that would better protect vulnerable populations. But it was Annie who provided the day's most moving moment. Now a confident woman with her own music academy in town, she stood before the assembled crowd and spoke with the eloquence of someone who'd found her voice through being truly heard. 20 years ago, I came to this ridge as a broken child who couldn't speak. She began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. I'd lost everything that mattered to me, and I believed that silence was the only safe response to a world that seemed determined to cause pain. She gestured toward Clara and Samuel standing together at the edge of the crowd. These people didn't try to fix me or force me to heal on their timeline. They simply loved me exactly as I was while believing I could become more. They showed me that strength didn't mean never falling down, it meant getting back up and then helping others do the same. Annie's gaze swept over the faces before her, many of whom carried their own stories of redemption and recovery. The miracle of this place isn't that it makes problems disappear, it's that it shows us problems can be transformed into purpose. Pain can become compassion, survival can become service. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. I teach music now to children all across this territory, and every time I help a young person find their voice, literally or figuratively, I'm continuing the work that started here. Every song they sing, every moment of joy they create, every life they touch with their art, it all traces back to two people who chose love over fear in a blizzard 25 years ago. The applause that followed was heartfelt but subdued, as if the crowd understood they were witnessing something sacred rather than merely celebratory. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of how much meaning could emerge from circumstances that had once seemed purely destructive. As the formal gathering dispersed and people began sharing meals and personal conversations, Dr. Martinez approached Clara with a proposal that would change everything once again. "Mrs. Granger," she began, "I want to ask you something that might sound presumptuous." Clara smiled, settling into a chair beside the younger woman. After 25 years of presumptuous requests from strangers who became family, I think I can handle whatever you have in mind." Rebecca laughed, some of her professional composure relaxing. "We want to establish a formal training program, a school, essentially, that would teach the principles you've developed here, not just the practical aspects of running a safe house or shelter, but the philosophical and psychological approaches that make healing possible." Clara's eyebrows rose. "You want to turn our home into a school?" "Not exactly," Rebecca clarified quickly. "We want to create an institution that would preserve and spread the knowledge you've accumulated through experience. Somewhere people could come to learn not just the mechanics of helping trauma survivors, but the deeper truths about human resilience and the power of unconditional love." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Clara had always been wary of institutionalizing what felt like a deeply personal calling, afraid that bureaucracy might strip away the heart that made their work effective. "What would such a school look like?" she asked carefully. Catherine joined the conversation, her enthusiasm evident. "We envision something revolutionary, an institution that treats the whole person, not just their immediate problems. Academic courses in psychology, medicine, and education, but also practical training in hospitality, conflict resolution, and community building." Dr. Cameron, who'd been listening from nearby, added her perspective. "Clara, you and Samuel have developed approaches to trauma recovery that are decades ahead of anything being taught in universities. The way you integrate physical healing with emotional support, individual care with community responsibility, it's groundbreaking work that deserves to be preserved and transmitted to future generations." Samuel appeared at Clara's elbow, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its implications. "What exactly are you proposing?" Dr. Martinez spread out another set of documents, architectural drawings, financial projections, letters of support from influential figures across multiple territories. "We want to build the Granger Institute for Healing Arts right here on the Ridge, a place where people could come to learn your methods and then take them back to their own communities." The plans were impressive in their scope and attention to detail. The proposed campus would blend into the natural landscape while providing modern facilities for education and research. Most importantly, it would maintain the home-like atmosphere that made the Ridge special dormitories designed as family-style housing, communal dining spaces, gardens, and workshops, where learning happened through doing rather than merely listening. "The funding is already secured," Catherine added. "Donations from people whose lives you've touched, grants from progressive organizations, even some government support from officials who understand the social value of what you do." Clara and Samuel studied the drawings in silence, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. Their simple mountain home had somehow become the center of a movement they'd never intended to start, and now they were being asked to help formalize that movement for future generations. "What would our role be?" Clara asked finally. "Whatever you want it to be," Dr. Cameron replied. "We hope you'd consider being the founding directors, at least initially. Your experience and wisdom would be invaluable in shaping the curriculum and establishing the culture we want to create." Samuel looked at Clara, seeing his own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in her eyes. They were both in their 60s now, entitled to the peaceful retirement they'd more than earned. But the opportunity to multiply their impact, to ensure that the lessons they'd learned through pain and dedication would survive beyond their own lifetimes, it was impossible to dismiss. "We'd need to think about it," Samuel said diplomatically. "Of course," Rebecca assured him. "This is an enormous decision, and we wouldn't expect an immediate answer. But please know that we're not asking you to abandon what you've built here. We want to help you expand it to create something that can serve people long after." She trailed off, unwilling to voice the reality that Clara and Samuel wouldn't be available to offer sanctuary forever. But the implication was clear, and it was one they'd all been avoiding confronting directly. That evening, after their guests had retired and the ridge had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Clara and Samuel took their customary walk through the gardens. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "What do you think?" Clara asked, her arm linked through his, as they followed the path they'd worn smooth over decades of such walks. "I think we're being offered a chance to build something permanent," Samuel replied thoughtfully. "Something that could outlast us and continue the work we've started." But Samuel smiled at how well she knew him. "But I worry about what happens when you try to systematize something that works because it's personal and spontaneous. How do you teach someone to love unconditionally? How do you institutionalize genuine compassion?" It was the same concern Clara had been wrestling with since the proposal was made. Their success had always been rooted in treating each person who came to them as unique, responding to individual needs rather than following prescribed protocols. The idea of creating a curriculum that could be replicated elsewhere was appealing, but it also felt potentially dangerous. "Maybe that's exactly why we need to be involved," Clara said slowly, "to make sure that whatever gets built maintains the heart of what we do here." They paused beside the memorial garden Samuel had created for June and the other children who'd died too young. Over the years, it had grown to include remembrances of all the lives that had touched theirs, former guests who'd passed away, friends and family members, even some of the people they'd been unable to help despite their best efforts. "She'd want us to say yes," Clara said quietly, her eyes on June's marker, a simple stone carved with a butterfly symbol of transformation and beauty, emerging from struggle. "How can you be sure?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the chain of events that had led from June's death to this moment. "Because she's part of everyone we've saved. Every time we've helped a child find safety, every time we've shown a woman that she deserves better than abuse, every time we've demonstrated that love can triumph over cruelty, we've been honoring her memory." Samuel nodded, understanding the logic, even as his heart struggled with the implications. Starting the institute would mean sharing their private sanctuary with the world in ways they never had before. It would mean accepting responsibilities beyond their own mountain, committing to goals that extended far beyond their remaining years. But it would also mean ensuring that the lessons they'd learned, the healing they'd witnessed, the love they'd cultivated, could continue to make a difference long after they were gone. "All right," Samuel said finally, "let's build a school." Clara turned to face him, her eyes bright with tears and excitement in equal measure. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that whatever we build, we'll build it together," Samuel replied, pulling her into his arms. "And I'm sure that's all that really matters." They stood there in the memorial garden, holding each other beneath the stars, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances and transformed it into a force that had literally changed the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve and heal and grow. But tonight there was just this, the perfect peace of knowing they'd chosen correctly once again to err on the side of love rather than fear. The fire that had been kindled between them 25 years ago had indeed never died. Instead, it had grown into something that could warm the whole world, one heart at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. The Granger Institute would become a reality, and through it, their legacy would extend far beyond anything they could have imagined when Samuel first spoke those words in the blizzard, "You're coming with me." But the true measure of their success wouldn't be found in buildings or curricula or formal programs. It would be found in the countless lives that had been transformed by witnessing love in action, by experiencing unconditional acceptance, by discovering that broken things could be made beautiful again if handled with enough care and patience and faith. The seeds of forever had been planted in the soil of their own suffering, watered with tears and tended with unshakable devotion. Now those seeds were ready to bloom across the world, carrying with them the simple but revolutionary truth that had always been at the heart of their story. Love is always worth the risk. Healing is always possible, and home is wherever people choose to see you as precious and treat you as such. The mountains slept peacefully around them, but the echo of their love would continue to reverberate through time, touching lives not yet born, healing wounds not yet inflicted, and proving over and over again that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the quiet, persistent choice to believe in the fundamental goodness of the human heart.